Welcome to another episode of The Dissection. Let's talk about the cabinet. In the coming days, it's going to be very important to understand the nature of the cabinet, the powers and duties of the cabinet. In this episode, I'm going to try to explain to you the constitutional law framework of executive authority, which includes the president and the cabinet. This is going to be very important in the coming weeks. As you can see, there are so many issues which are going to arise, and because it's a coalition, there may be some things that you need to understand in order to really get a shape of how is this administration going to look like. In case you didn't know, and in case you're watching for the first time, I actually did study law at Wits University, and I graduated with my LLB from Wits University. So I didn't do it as a course or anything like that. I did the whole degree in law. So let's go. Executive authority. Executive authority is the power to execute rules of law. National executive authority is exercised in the whole territory of a state on matters that do not fall within the functional areas of other levels of government. Executive organs of the state plan, coordinate, and manage the state activities. They fulfill a key role in planning policy and the content of rules of law that legislative bodies approve. Distinction is made between executive power and executive functions. Executive power amounts to the capacity to enforce a legal rule coercively against others. The performance of functions does not always mean that power is exercised because there's no coercion. So that distinction is made between executive power and executive functions. According to the South African Constitution, the national executive authority is exercised in 5 ways. Number 1, implementing national legislation. Number 2, developing and implementing national policy. Number 3, coordinating the functions of state departments and administration. Number 4, preparing and initiating legislation. Number 5, performing any other executive function provided for in the Constitution or national legislation. In South Africa, the Constitution and other statutes are the main sources of executive power. The national executive authority is exercised by the president, the ministers, and any other functionary to whom it is assigned by the Constitution or national legislation. Responsibility, right? Section 85 of the Constitution provides that the executive authority of the Republic is vested in the president and that the president exercises it together with other members of the cabinet. Section 92.2 says that members of the cabinet, the president, the deputy president, and ministers are accountable collectively and individually to Parliament for the exercise of their powers and performance of their function. This gives effect to the principle that the executive is accountable to the Parliament as the body which is directly elected by the voters. In a coalition government, the role of accountability is going to really be in that opposition bench side, where we're seeing that the DA, all of these other parties are part of this coalition. So the official opposition is going to be the MK party, whether you love them, whether you hate them. Dr. John Hlophe is going to be the leader of opposition, and he's going to have a responsibility because he'll have the most speaking time when particular, parliamentary processes happen. And part of that speaking time will be to exercise this role of accountability and oversight. Obviously, the EFF will also be participating in that, and other parties which are not part of the coalition. But because so many parties of the 18 parties, I think 10 parties are in the coalition, if I'm not mistaken. We may have another party join late. It's unclear, for instance, whether Build One South Africa will join or if they'll just support outside of the formal coalition. But that just basically leaves 8 political parties to perform the very important function of oversight and accountability. It's not likely that members of parliament within the coalition partner parties are going to be very robust in holding each other accountable, but that's what the Constitution does require of them. Anyway, let's go. Individual responsibility. The president, the deputy, and each minister are individually accountable to parliament for the exercise and performance of their powers and duties. They have 3 particular duties. Number 1, they have a duty to explain how the powers and duties under their control have been exercised and performed. So they have to come and explain. That's part of the challenge that we had. For instance, Pravin Gordhan would not come and explain himself. He would avoid parliament. He would avoid parliamentary committees. In doing so, he was violating his constitutional duty. And it's going to be important to make sure, and the media has to play a role in making sure that they underline when particular ministers don't show up and they don't do their part. They are supposed to do that. They are supposed to explain how their powers and duties have been exercised. Number two, they have a duty to acknowledge, right? What do they have to acknowledge? They have to acknowledge when a mistake has been made and promise to rectify the matter. This is another one of the biggest shortcomings of cabinet ministers. They have never conceded and they don't want to concede. And it will be interesting to see if this culture changes when you have the DA, the IFP and other coalition partners. For instance, Pravin Gordhan was asked many questions about the sale of South African Airways for 51 rands. He could not explain the sale and he was very defensive and belligerent and accusatorial to Parliament, which was exercising its role, and he would not acknowledge that mistakes had been made, right? And even now he's not returning to Parliament, so he cannot face the parliamentary scrutiny as a minister over some of the decisions that he made. A lot of things were privatized under him and privatization processes were started under him, but there's not necessarily been the kind of acknowledgement and oversight that you would need to actually understand what is being done. The third one is that they have a duty to resign. They have a duty to resign if personal responsibility has been accepted. This is something that doesn't happen enough. Predominantly what's happened is that when people are charged or if there are big scandals, they do resign, but it's been few and far in between. With the levels of corruption that are prevalent in South Africa, it's surprising that there hasn't been a larger number of ministers that have actually resigned and accepted personal responsibility. So we're going to have to see if in this particular cabinet, that principle of personal responsibility will be one that begins to show up, or maybe it won't be one that begins to show up. The president also is individually accountable to Parliament for the exercise of his powers and function, for the exercise of all of his powers and functions. There's also an element of collective responsibility, right? The members of a cabinet act in unison to the outside world and carry joint responsibility before Parliament for the way in which each member exercises their and performs their powers and functions. So this means not only are they collectively responsible, right, but they are also responsible for the conduct of each. Do you see it? Do you see it? So we're going to have to see if this collective responsibility finds expression in the way that the Constitution required it to. So what it means is that because there is a collective responsibility, individual ministers as well have an obligation to call each other out when there is misconduct within the cabinet. It's not likely to happen, but it's also implied in the legislation. Right. Let's talk about ministers in particular, because this is the game. This is what is being announced. This is the big event. Ministers are appointed to administer state departments and sometimes to perform other functions that are not related to the administration of a state department. If a minister is appointed to administer one or more state departments, the minister has a so-called portfolio. Right, that's what portfolio means. It means that they administer one or more state department. Right? Technical definition of a portfolio. A portfolio comprises all the statutory and other functions and powers pertaining to the department or departments for which the person has been appointed. I chewed that up, so let me read it again. A portfolio comprises all the statutory and other functions and powers pertaining to the department or departments for which a person has been appointed. If they are appointed to perform only functions other than the administration of a department, they are called a minister without portfolio. So if you hear about ministers without portfolio, that's where it comes from. Ministers are members of the highest joint executive body in the state, right? And here are some implications of that. The dual functions of ministers, namely as head of departments and as members of cabinet, has particular implications. Implication number one It links the daily administration of the state at a national level directly to the highest policy-making executive body. And secondly, it puts the entire national administration under political control. So ministers are not trivial. They are the heads of departments who are running these particular departments, and they have the political oversight over those departments. It's not a trivial thing, and it's a very serious and grave task. They're running big budgets and they have big responsibilities. Right, appointment. And this is obviously the big event of today. Ministers are formally appointed and dismissed by the president. The president has free discretion in the appointing and dismissing of ministers. The president may dismiss a minister when the president has no longer got any confidence in the minister, or when the minister turns out to be incapable of performing his or her duties. And we know that even though the Constitution allows for this, this can be an area of contestation, right? Because we saw with the dismissal of the Minister of Finance by Jacob Zuma that it led to the rand falling, protests, all kinds of drama. So even though that power exists, they can be checks and balances in society and other places. And sometimes those checks and balances may end up being illegitimate, because if a president is elected to do a particular thing, but they can no longer exercise their duty because of the markets or investors or powerful billionaires, that also can be an issue where the state no longer is fully in the control of government. But in any event, that prerogative rests with the president. Qualifications. Ministers must comply with the qualifications for being members of parliament. There's no other qualification required. The question then is there a need for a revision of that? I'm asking earnestly here. The reason why I'm saying this is because departments are complicated. They require often theoretical knowledge. They require often technical knowledge. And they require often leadership skills. Politicians aren't necessarily vetted for those skills when they join a political party. For instance, you can be a loudmouth racist who has a large following, calling people the N-word and the K-word. And a political party can approach you and say, hey, you've got over 100,000 followers on YouTube. You know, we need constituency. We're really facing challenges. Do you want to join our party and be our candidate? And you can say yes. And that's it. That's the qualification. So potentially you can have a person who wears blackface, uses the N-word, and just becomes a minister. No qualification whatsoever pertaining to the very department that they're supposed to administer. Of course, education is not everything, but it is something. Education is what allows us to measure your proficiency, your capacity in a structured framework. So if you've not gone through a structured framework where we can assess your proficiency, your capacity, and you've also not worked in particular areas and spaces, how then can we really be sure that you are going to do a good job in those particular areas where you are appointed or placed? Realistically. So for instance, if I sold dog shampoo, right? And that was my first job. Then I became a politician because I saw that, hey, selling dog shampoo is hard, man. People don't want to shampoo their dogs, they're just going to hose pipe them. Then I said, oh, you know what? Let me join this party here. And then I joined that party and I speak well because I'm a dog shampoo salesman. So I've got, speaking qualities. I'm a public speaker. Then I rise up through the ranks because, the granny who's running the party likes me or whatever the case may be. Now, all of a sudden, I'm leader of the party. Right? And I've been in parliament giving my speeches, which other people may have written for me. And now I'm supposed to run a department. Am I truly qualified to run that department? Are we supposed to just presume that if we see you in that capacity being appointed, you have expertise? The problems being faced are so serious. Unemployment, poverty, inequality. The challenges in many of these departments are technical. How can you really supervise a technical group of bureaucrats without any technical expertise? For example, let's say I was a soccer player, right? I become a very popular soccer player. I join a party. Let's say I join Freedom Front Plus, right? And there, we have a very successful election. And then Freedom Front Plus, Connie Mulder appoints me as the Minister of Finance. I have no accounting knowledge. I do not know management, finance, accounting, finance. What am I going to do in that portfolio? Can we accept that the Minister of Finance needs to have financial training? Can we accept that? We can, right? So why wouldn't that apply to all of the other places? Would we really be comfortable with me as an athlete in that example becoming the Minister of Health? We are more comfortable when the Minister of Health actually is a qualified doctor, right? We are, because they're able to understand public health. They're able to understand the fundamentals of, epidemiology, and to understand the fundamentals of pathology, all of that stuff, which is essential. But they're also able to understand how medical practice actually works, because a large part of the work of running a department of health deals with those technical matters. Of course, you can have emotional intelligence. You can have leadership qualities that you got at church or on the sports field or wherever the case may be. But is there not a requirement for expertise? Or are we saying that we no longer care about expertise? I remember when people were laughing at Jacob Zuma for not having completed, standard 6, standard 5, whatever the case may be. They were laughing at him. It was a topic of constant mockery when he made mistakes reading numbers, or when he made mistakes, speaking in English. It was a continuous mockery. And the premise, the implication was, this man is not educated. And because he's not educated, we are getting poor quality outcomes as a result of that lack of education. I'm asking broadly here, do you not think that there needs to be a review? Of course, there are challenges with creating educational barriers to access to representation, because some people are from marginalized communities and may not be able to fully explore education. But surely we should think about this question. Food for thought. Let's hear what you think. What are the powers of a minister? Ministers possess all the powers assigned to them by law, and they exercise them in accordance with the provision of the Constitution and any other legislation. The Constitution provides that members of the cabinet must act in accordance with the code of ethics prescribed by national legislation. In particular, and this is going to get a little bit controversial, but I think it's important for you to think about, right? In particular, they may not partake in any other paid work. What happens when you own a business that makes profits from the sale of goods? For example, buffaloes, right? Can you be said to not really be receiving payment when you are the primary shareholder and any benefits that accrue? So payment can be a salary, but dividends, are they not a payment? Is that not something that we ought to think about? So now if all of a sudden all of these ministers open businesses, someone becomes Minister of Sports, but then he also has a sporting shop, right? And all of a sudden government is now saying that we need to, subsidize the cost of athletic equipment, such as T-shirts, etc., etc. And then all of a sudden his company wins those tenders. Are we not going to say, hey, that's actually problematic because you are the minister? And he'll say, no, I'm not getting paid. I'm not selling the T-shirts directly, and my company won that tender without your involvement. What about if people recognize that, hey, I want the minister to help me in actually setting up my business? So I know he owns a shop which sells T-shirts. Let me go buy 1 million T-shirts, one bulk order. And then later on, I'll go and look for the minister and say, hey, minister, please, can you consider 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Right? So that the Constitution says in the code that they may not undertake in any other paid work. What I'm asking you, and this is the controversial question, is, are people actually doing that now? What do you think? Anyway, they may not also act in a way that is inconsistent with their office. They may not expose themselves to any situation involving the risk of conflict between their official responsibilities and their private interests. Not involving conflict, involving the risk. So the standard is higher than an actual conflict. It's a risk of conflict. So if you can see that, hey, this thing, I'm the sports minister, I've got a sports shop. Now this guy who runs a sports business just bought 1 million T-shirts from my shop. That could be considered a risk of conflict of interest. Food for thought, food for thought. They may not use their position or information entrusted to them to enrich themselves or improperly benefit another person. For example, if you have a brother-in-law who wants to own wind and solar energy companies, as a minister, you're not supposed to help that guy out. Just saying, just saying. Right. So when a minister is unable to fulfill the duties of their office, any other minister may be appointed temporarily to act in that minister's stead. A deputy minister cannot do this. They are not part of cabinet. Are they necessary? Are they necessary if they're not part of cabinet? It's a big waste of money. They get the security, they get all of these perks, they get a large salary, but they cannot even act in an acting capacity when that member of cabinet is not available, right? So deputy ministers, they are appointed to assist members of the cabinet, and we've seen sometimes they get isolated. It doesn't actually work out like that. They are not members of cabinet. The president may appoint deputy ministers from among the members of the National Assembly and may dismiss them. Control. How does control over the executive body exist? The public exercises control through the press and other media. That's why it's very important to have an independent media. Right now we have a media that doesn't want to criticize certain ministers, that doesn't want to ask some of the questions that I was asking earlier in the video, because they support. If you look, for example, News 24, very supportive of the Democratic Alliance. If you look at Sunday Times, very supportive of President Ramaphosa. Business Day, very supportive of President Ramaphosa. ENCA, very supportive of President Ramaphosa. Now, what happens when the media now has, positions and players that they prefer? How does that work for the public to be able to exercise their control over these particular bodies, right? Freedom of expression and freedom of the press, as far as actions of the government are concerned, are of crucial importance. But if you have co-option of the press, that can actually suppress the public oversight role. Parliamentary control. There is a parliamentary system of executive control. It is the constitutional responsibility of the members of parliament as elected representatives of the voters and of parliament as an institution to control the activities on behalf of the electorate. The Constitution provides that the National Assembly must provide for mechanisms to ensure that all executive organs are accountable to the Assembly and to maintain oversight of the exercise of national executive authority. In addition to parliamentary debates, the following forms of parliamentary control over the executive exist. Number 1, question time. Number 2, parliamentary committees. Number 3, the tabling of subordinate legislation. And subordinate legislation includes proclamations and regulations. Also the tabling of reports by the executive in order to keep Parliament informed. The assumption around the tabling of subordinate legislation is that Parliament may actually reject that subordinate legislation by the executive. The approval of a budget is another key way that oversight exists. And then the consideration of reports by the Auditor General. These are the ways that Parliament exercises its control. So we're going to have to see how robust the MK, the EFF, and all of those other entities are going to be in overseeing this, right? So I want to say, I'm going to do a detailed breakdown of the cabinet that has been announced by President Ramaphosa. Expect that tomorrow. So if you come around here, you're going to see that detailed analysis and breakdown. But I thought it's important to also provide a constitutional framework, a constitutional understanding of actually this animal called the cabinet. So now you know, you understand. This is Constitutional Law 101. Brought to you by Mighty Jamie TV, brought to you by The Dissection. I hope you enjoyed it. If you haven't subscribed, please consider subscribing. It helps the YouTube algorithm know that you love this content and you want to see more of this content. So wait for that full breakdown. Till the next one,